In the shadowed corridors of history, where empires have crumbled and kings have fallen, one truth has emerged from the ashes of countless defeats. The man who conquers his own weakness becomes unconquerable to the world. Niccolo Machiavelli, that shrewd observer of human nature and political reality, understood this fundamental principle better than perhaps any thinker before or since. His observations on power, resilience, and the forging of character through adversity remain as relevant today as they were in the turbulent Italian Renaissance. When life delivers its inevitable blows, when fortune turns her wheel and sends us tumbling into the depths of failure, humiliation, and despair, we stand at a crossroads that will define the very essence of our being. Most men, when pushed down by circumstances beyond their control, remain prostrate, nursing their wounds and cursing fate. They become bitter, broken, diminished versions of themselves, forever haunted by what they once were or what they might have been. But there exists another breed of man entirely, one who understands that every fall is but a prelude to a greater rise, every defeat a classroom for future victory. The transformation from weakness to strength is not a gentle metamorphosis but a violent crucible that burns away everything soft, uncertain, and dependent within us. It is the process by which a man learns to stand alone against the storm, to find within himself resources he never knew existed, and to emerge from trials not merely intact but fundamentally changed, harder, wiser, more dangerous to those who would seek to destroy him. The crucible of adversity, where weak men are destroyed and strong men are born. The merchant Paolo Benedetti learned this lesson in the winter of 1503, when Cesare Borgia's armies swept through the Romagna like a plague, destroying everything in their path. Paolo had built his fortune slowly, carefully, over 3 decades of patient trading and diplomatic marriages. He owned warehouses in Florence, Venice, and Rome. His ships carried silk and spices across the Mediterranean. His name was respected in the great banking houses of Europe. Then, in a single month, everything was gone. Borgia's lieutenants requisitioned his ships for military transport. His warehouses were converted to armories. His debtors, seeing weakness, refused payment while his creditors demanded immediate settlement. Rival merchants, once deferential, now mocked him openly in the piazzas. His own family, sensing the shift in fortune, began to distance themselves. Within weeks, Paolo Benedetti went from being one of Florence's most influential citizens to a man walking the streets with empty pockets and hollow eyes. But Paolo possessed something that his detractors had not counted upon, a capacity for self-examination that bordered on the brutal. Instead of raging against Borgia or cursing the fickleness of fate, he sat in his empty mansion and asked himself the most dangerous question a man can ask: what weaknesses within me allowed this destruction? For most men, such self-scrutiny would have led to despair. For Paolo, it became the foundation of his resurrection. He identified his fatal flaw immediately. He had built his empire on dependencies. He had relied on others' honor, others' gratitude, others' fear of social consequences. He had assumed that treaties would be honored, that alliances would hold, that the civilized veneer of commerce would protect him from the raw exercise of power. In short, he had been naive. And naivety, in a world where wolves prowl among sheep, is a form of weakness that invites destruction. The old Paolo would have spent months lamenting his losses, seeking sympathy, perhaps even begging his former peers for assistance. But the man who emerged from that winter of contemplation was someone entirely different. This new Paolo understood that strength comes not from what you can build, but from what you can survive losing. He had been stripped of everything external: wealth, status, comfort, security, and discovered that he was still alive, still capable of thought and action, still possessed of will and intelligence. More importantly, he realized that his former life, for all its apparent success, had been built upon a foundation of sand. He had been weak precisely because he had been comfortable, vulnerable precisely because he had been protected. The destruction of his old life was not a catastrophe, but a liberation from illusions that had made him fragile. This recognition marked the beginning of his true education. Paolo began to study power as he had once studied trade routes, with meticulous attention to detail and absolute commitment to understanding the underlying realities rather than the surface appearances. He observed how Borgia maintained control not through love or respect, but through a careful calculation of fear and benefit. He watched how survivors in the city adapted, noting who bent with the wind and who broke, who found opportunity in chaos and who merely endured. Within a year, Paolo had transformed himself from a conventional merchant into something far more formidable. He approached Borgia's administrators not as a supplicant seeking the return of his property, but as a man offering valuable services. He had learned languages, studied military logistics, cultivated relationships with soldiers and bureaucrats who actually held power rather than merely appeared to hold it. When he spoke now, there was something in his voice that commanded attention, not the desperate eagerness of the defeated, but the quiet confidence of someone who had stared into the abyss and walked away unbroken. The key to Paolo's transformation lay in his understanding of a fundamental truth that Machiavelli would later articulate. A man's strength is not measured by what he possesses, but by what he can do without. The merchant who depends on his warehouses is at the mercy of anyone who can destroy warehouses. The politician who depends on popular approval is vulnerable to anyone who can sway the mob. The warrior who depends on his physical prowess is helpless when age or injury claims his body. But the man who has learned to find his strength within himself, who has developed the internal resources to survive any external loss, becomes truly dangerous, not because of what he has, but because of what he is. This internal strength manifests in ways that are subtle but unmistakable. There is a stillness in such men that others find unsettling, a sense that they are not quite playing by the same rules as everyone else. They do not seek approval because they have learned to validate themselves. They do not fear rejection because they have already survived abandonment. They do not crumble under pressure because they have already endured the worst that life can offer and emerged intact. Paolo's transformation was complete when he realized that Cesare Borgia, for all his apparent power, was actually more fragile than the broken merchant had ever been. Borgia's strength depended entirely on external factors: his father's papal authority, his army's loyalty, his enemy's fear. Remove any of these supports, and the great Cesare Borgia would collapse as surely as any ordinary man. Paolo, however, had learned to build his strength on a foundation that no external force could touch: his own unbreakable will and his hard-won understanding of reality. When Borgia's power began to crumble following his father's death, Paolo was ready. He had spent his time in exile not plotting revenge or nursing grievances, but preparing for opportunity. He understood that in the chaos following Borgia's fall, there would be spaces for new powers to emerge, but only for those who had learned how to survive without protection, how to act without guarantees, how to build strength from nothing but will and intelligence. The lesson that Paolo learned, and that every man must learn if he wishes to become truly strong, is that adversity is not something to be avoided or overcome, but embraced and transformed into wisdom. The comfortable man knows nothing of his own capabilities because they have never been tested. The man who has been broken and rebuilt himself knows exactly what he is capable of enduring and achieving. This knowledge becomes a form of power that cannot be taken away because it exists not in circumstances, but in character. The architecture of internal fortification, building unassailable strength. The transformation from external dependence to internal strength requires a systematic reconstruction of one's entire approach to existence. It is not enough to simply endure hardship. One must learn to extract from each trial the specific lessons that will prevent future weakness. This process demands a level of self-honesty that most men find unbearable, for it requires acknowledging not only our failures but the character flaws that made those failures inevitable. Consider the case of Lorenzo de' Medici during his exile from Florence in 1494. When the French invasion and Savonarola's rise to power drove the Medici family from their ancestral city, Lorenzo faced a choice that would define his future. He could spend his exile plotting his return to the old order, surrounding himself with other displaced nobles and dreaming of restoration, or he could use this period of powerlessness to understand why the Medici had become vulnerable in the first place. Lorenzo chose the harder path. Rather than retreating into comfortable delusions about his family's inherent right to rule, he examined the structural weaknesses that had made their downfall possible. He realized that the Medici had become complacent in their power, assuming that their patronage of artists and their financial influence would be sufficient to maintain control indefinitely. They had failed to adapt to changing political realities, ignored the growing resentment of their rule, and most critically, had allowed their strength to become dependent on factors beyond their direct control. During his years of exile, Lorenzo undertook a radical program of self-development that would have been impossible while he enjoyed the privileges of power. He studied military science with veterans of various European campaigns, learning not just tactics but the psychology of warfare. He immersed himself in the classical texts on statecraft, reading Livy and Tacitus not as entertaining histories, but as practical manuals for understanding human nature under pressure. Most importantly, he began to cultivate relationships based on mutual benefit rather than inherited obligation. The process was painful because it required admitting that much of his previous life had been based on illusion. The courtiers who had praised his wisdom had been seeking favor, not speaking truth. The advisors who had flattered his judgment had been protecting their own positions. The citizens who had appeared loyal had simply been calculating that obedience was more profitable than rebellion. By stripping away these comfortable deceptions, Lorenzo was forced to confront the reality of his own limitations. But this confrontation became the foundation of genuine strength. When Lorenzo finally returned to Florence in 1512, he was no longer the same man who had fled 18 years earlier. The old Lorenzo had ruled through habit and expectation. The new Lorenzo ruled through understanding and will. He had learned to read the subtle signs of political change, to identify potential threats before they became dangerous, and most importantly, to maintain multiple sources of strength so that no single failure could destroy him again. The key insight that Lorenzo developed during his exile was that true power cannot be inherited, borrowed, or granted by others. It must be built through deliberate action and conscious choice. Every morning, he began with what he called his inventory of dependencies, systematically reviewing every aspect of his life that relied on factors beyond his control: his food supply, his information networks, his military support, his financial resources. Each was examined for vulnerabilities and strengthened through diversification and preparation. His practice of systematic self-fortification extended beyond material concerns to psychological and spiritual dimensions. Lorenzo trained himself to find satisfaction in internal achievements rather than external recognition. He developed the ability to maintain equilibrium in the face of both praise and criticism, understanding that both were often tactical rather than truthful. Most importantly, he cultivated what he termed the fortress of solitude, the capacity to be alone with himself without discomfort, to make decisions without needing approval, and to maintain his sense of purpose even when abandoned by allies. The architecture of this internal fortification follows certain universal principles that any man can apply, regardless of his circumstances or station. The first principle is radical self-reliance, the systematic elimination of unnecessary dependencies that create vulnerabilities. This does not mean becoming a hermit or refusing all cooperation, but rather ensuring that one's core strength and identity remain intact even when all external supports are removed. The second principle is the cultivation of useful skills that cannot be taken away by political change or economic upheaval. Lorenzo became fluent in multiple languages, learned to assess military situations quickly and accurately, developed expertise in financial analysis, and most importantly, mastered the ability to read human character and motivation. These capabilities belonged to him personally and would serve him regardless of his formal position or circumstances. The third principle is the development of what Machiavelli would later call virtue, not virtue in the conventional moral sense, but the combination of skill, courage, and adaptability that enables a man to impose his will upon circumstances rather than being shaped by them. This requires constant practice in making difficult decisions without adequate information, acting decisively in ambiguous situations, and maintaining purpose in the face of setbacks and disappointments. The fourth principle is the creation of multiple, independent sources of value and influence. Lorenzo learned never again to depend entirely on any single relationship, institution, or strategy. He maintained different circles of allies who were unaware of each other's existence, developed various revenue streams that could not be simultaneously disrupted, and cultivated competencies in several different areas so that failure in one domain would not leave him helpless. The final and most crucial principle is the regular practice of voluntary hardship and deliberate discomfort. Lorenzo understood that strength, like muscle, atrophies without resistance. He regularly placed himself in challenging situations, sought out difficult problems to solve, and deliberately exposed himself to controlled forms of adversity. This practice served two purposes. It maintained his capacity to handle genuine crises when they arose, and it prevented him from becoming attached to comfort in ways that would create new vulnerabilities. The man who applies these principles systematically transforms himself from a creature of circumstance into a force of nature. He becomes someone who shapes events rather than merely responding to them, who finds opportunity in chaos rather than being overwhelmed by it, and who grows stronger through opposition rather than being weakened by it. Such a man cannot be destroyed by external forces because his true strength lies beyond their reach, in his character, his skills, his understanding, and his unbreakable will to persist and prevail. The emergence of unconquerable will. When inner strength becomes external power, the transition from self-fortification to genuine power represents the most delicate and dangerous phase in the development of unassailable strength. Many men who successfully rebuild themselves after devastating losses fail at this crucial juncture, either by reverting to old patterns of dependence or by becoming so focused on invulnerability that they lose the capacity for effective action. The truly formidable man learns to project his internal strength outward while maintaining the hard-won lessons of his transformation. Giovanni Sforza understood this principle intimately when he reclaimed the lordship of Pesaro in 1503. His first reign had ended in humiliation when Cesare Borgia forced him to annul his marriage to Lucrezia Borgia and flee his own city. The young Giovanni, who ran away in the night, was everything that Machiavelli would have recognized as contemptible. Weak, dependent, more concerned with appearance than reality, ruling through inherited right rather than demonstrated capability. The man who returned to claim Pesaro 7 years later bore little resemblance to the frightened boy who had fled. Giovanni's exile had been spent not in comfortable courts seeking sympathy and support, but in the harsh borderlands between the Ottoman Empire and Christendom, where survival depended entirely on personal competence and nothing else mattered but results. He had fought as a common soldier, learned to command through earning respect rather than demanding it, and most importantly, discovered that he possessed capabilities that comfort and security had never allowed him to develop. When Giovanni finally returned to Pesaro, he did so not as a displaced nobleman seeking restoration, but as a conqueror claiming what he had earned through his transformation. The citizens who witnessed his return noticed immediately that something fundamental had changed. Where the old Giovanni had been hesitant and deferential, constantly seeking approval and validation, this new version spoke with quiet authority that made opposition seem futile. He walked differently, made decisions quickly and without apparent doubt, and most unsettling of all, seemed genuinely indifferent to whether others liked or approved of his choices. The key to Giovanni's successful transition from internal strength to external power lay in his understanding of what Machiavelli called the proper relationship between fear and love in leadership. The old Giovanni had desperately sought to be loved, making concessions and compromises that weakened his position and invited challenges to his authority. The new Giovanni understood that while love is pleasant when it exists, fear is far more reliable as a foundation for obedience. More importantly, he had learned that genuine respect, the most durable basis for lasting authority, comes only from demonstrated competence and unwavering purpose. This transformation was most evident in how Giovanni handled the first serious challenge to his restored rule. A coalition of local nobles, encouraged by papal representatives who preferred a weaker ruler in Pesaro, attempted to organize resistance to his policies. The old Giovanni would have tried to negotiate, seeking compromise and attempting to win over his opponents through concessions and appeals to their better nature. The new Giovanni responded with devastating swiftness and precision. Rather than attacking his enemies directly, Giovanni demonstrated his transformed understanding of power by striking at their sources of strength. He quietly gathered detailed information about each conspirator's vulnerabilities, their debts, their family scandals, their secret alliances, their personal fears. Then, in a single coordinated action, he simultaneously destroyed their ability to oppose him without directly harming their persons. Debts were called in, compromising letters were made public, secret agreements were exposed, and powerful patrons were presented with evidence that made continued support impossible. The brilliance of Giovanni's approach lay not in its ruthlessness but in its economy and precision. By demonstrating that he possessed both the intelligence to uncover his enemies' weaknesses and the discipline to exploit them systematically rather than emotionally, he sent a clear message about the futility of opposition. More importantly, he showed that his power rested not on inherited position or external support, but on his own capabilities and determination. The conspirators' swift collapse had a profound psychological impact on everyone who witnessed it. They realized they were dealing with someone who operated according to different rules than they understood. Someone who had access to information and capabilities that made conventional opposition strategies ineffective. This recognition created what Machiavelli identified as the most valuable political asset: the reputation for being more dangerous than one appears, combined with the restraint to use that danger only when necessary. Giovanni's transformation from weak to strong was complete when he achieved something that had eluded him during his first reign: the ability to inspire genuine loyalty rather than mere obedience. The citizens of Pesaro began to take pride in their lord's competence and strength, understanding that his formidable reputation protected them from the predations of stronger neighbors. His subordinates competed for his approval not because they feared punishment, but because they recognized that serving under such a leader enhanced their own capabilities and prospects. This shift from compliance based on fear to loyalty based on respect represents the highest achievement of strength built through adversity. The man who has reconstructed himself after complete destruction possesses a quality that cannot be faked or inherited: absolute conviction in his own capability. This conviction is not arrogance or delusion, but the quiet confidence that comes from having tested oneself under the most challenging circumstances and emerged victorious. Such a man becomes magnetic to others precisely because his strength is self-generated rather than dependent on external validation. People instinctively recognize the difference between someone who needs their approval and someone who would be perfectly content without it. This recognition creates a psychological dynamic where others actively seek the approval of someone who clearly does not need theirs, generating influence that extends far beyond formal authority or position. The unconquerable man understands that his greatest power lies not in what he can do to others, but in what others cannot do to him. Having already survived the destruction of everything external he once valued, he no longer fears any threat that depends on taking something away from him. Having learned to find satisfaction and purpose entirely within himself, he cannot be manipulated through appeals to vanity, comfort, or social approval. Having developed multiple independent sources of capability and value, he cannot be controlled through creating dependencies or threatening to withdraw support. This psychological invulnerability manifests as a form of freedom that others find both attractive and unsettling. The unconquerable man acts according to his own judgment rather than seeking consensus, pursues his objectives without needing encouragement or permission, and maintains his principles regardless of social pressure or material incentive. Such behavior inspires either devoted loyalty or intense hostility, but never indifference. And in the struggle for power and influence, being noticed and respected is far more valuable than being universally liked. The final stage of this transformation occurs when the man who has made himself unconquerable through internal strength begins to create external structures that reflect and amplify his personal capabilities. Giovanni Sforza's rebuilt lordship of Pesaro became more prosperous and secure than it had ever been under his original rule, not because circumstances had improved, but because the quality of leadership had been fundamentally transformed. His subjects enjoyed greater safety, his allies found him more reliable, and his enemies discovered that opposition carried costs they were unwilling to bear. This external manifestation of internal strength creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Success builds reputation. Reputation attracts capable allies. Capable allies enable greater successes, and greater successes enhance reputation. The man who began by learning to stand alone discovers that his very independence attracts others, who wish to be associated with strength and competence. He ends by wielding influence that extends far beyond his formal position, commanding respect that transcends his official authority, and enjoying a form of security that no external protection could provide. The ultimate achievement of the man who rises stronger from life's attempts to destroy him is not merely personal invulnerability, but the capacity to create value and opportunity for others through his own transformed strength. Having learned the hard lessons of dependence and vulnerability, he becomes someone others can depend upon. Having mastered the art of self-reliance, he becomes worth relying upon. Having conquered his own weaknesses, he becomes capable of helping others overcome theirs. This transformation from victim to victor, from dependent to dependable, from vulnerable to invulnerable, represents the highest expression of human potential under adversity. It demonstrates that no external force, however powerful, can ultimately destroy a man who has learned to find his strength within himself. Such men become legends not because of what they achieved in spite of their struggles, but because of what they became through embracing and transforming those struggles into wisdom, capability, and unshakable strength. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has already endured the worst destruction possible, the complete annihilation of his former identity, and has proven to himself and the world that he can rise from such destruction stronger than he was before. This knowledge becomes a source of power that no external force can touch, a foundation of strength that no enemy can undermine, and a wellspring of confidence that no setback can permanently disturb. In the end, Machiavelli's greatest insight was not about politics or power, but about human nature itself, that within every man lies the potential for unconquerable strength, waiting to be awakened by the right combination of necessity, will, and wisdom. The men who realize this potential do not merely survive life's attempts to destroy them, they transform those very attempts into the raw material of their own greatness, emerging from each trial not merely intact, but fundamentally improved, not merely unbroken, but genuinely unbreakable.